Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about being the chief executive of a global monopoly. You control, the most valuable commodities on Earth, only to wake up one morning and realize a rival startup has figured out how to bypass your entire supply chain.
Right, by just sailing completely around a continent.
Exactly. Overnight, your leverage just evaporates. So today, we are stepping straight into the 16th century, right into the center of this monumental clash between two global titans. I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire and the Portuguese Empire.
It is a massive conflict.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the decades-long military, economic, and naval struggle over the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the lucrative global spice trade, relying entirely on the historical sources provided.
And for you listening, this is an exploration of how global supply chains, naval technology, and imperial ambitions shaped the modern world.
Yeah, it is a history that absolutely proves economic warfare is entirely not a modern invention. So to understand the geopolitical chessboard here, we have to establish the baseline, right? Like, what was the traditional economic world order before the turn of the 16th century?
Well, prior to 1498, the flow of goods from the east. So we're specifically talking about spices like black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and then also silks and precious stones. They followed a very specific, heavily taxed route.
A very profitable route for the people controlling it.
Oh, incredibly profitable. These goods moved across the Indian Ocean on Arab and Indian dhows, and then they traveled up through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf.
Okay, so up through the Middle East.
Right. They crossed overland through Egypt or Mesopotamia and finally reached the Mediterranean. There, Venetian and Genoese merchants purchased them at a massive premium to distribute across Europe.
So whoever is sitting in the middle of that route is just making an absolute fortune.
Exactly. The powers that controlled those transit points, like the Mamluks in Egypt and eventually the Ottoman Empire, after they conquered the region in 1517, they extracted enormous wealth simply by standing in the middle and collecting customs duties.
That geographic bottleneck was basically a license to print money. But then, in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama circumnavigates Africa.
Yeah, he rounds the Cape of Good Hope.
Right. He drops anchor in India. He effectively found a back door.
He fundamentally broke the monopoly. Suddenly, Europe had direct access to the source of the spices, cutting out the Middle Eastern middlemen entirely.
But the Portuguese didn't just stop at exploration, right? Like, they didn't just say, oh, cool, we found a new way to sail here.
No, not at all. The sources detail how, by 1515, the Portuguese admiral Alfonso de Albuquerque had aggressively established this fortified port network all across the Indian Ocean.
What kind of ports are we talking about?
Well, he seized key coastal cities and islands. Places like Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Muscat on the Arabian Peninsula, and Hormuz, which is right at the entrance to the Persian Gulf.
Okay, so they are locking down the entire map.
They really are. The Portuguese strategy was not about conquering vast inland territories. It was entirely about building a maritime infrastructure.
Designed to just force all trade onto their ships.
Exactly. They wanted to divert the flow of spices away from the Red Sea and send it entirely around Africa to Lisbon.
Man, the economic impact of that diversion on the Ottoman Empire must have been severe. We are talking about a major disruption to their primary source of liquid wealth.
The financial stakes are actually laid out really plainly in a 1525 report. It was submitted by the Ottoman naval commander Selman Reis.
And what did he find?
He analyzed the fiscal damage the Portuguese were inflicting. In his report, he noted that before the Portuguese dominated the region, the Ottomans were generating an income of around 200,000 gold coins.
Wow, 200,000.
And that is strictly from the merchant ships calling at the port of Aden alone. That doesn't even factor in the massive customs income obtained from the spice trade as it passed through the markets of Cairo and Alexandria down in Egypt.
So the Portuguese objective was the total diversion of that trade to the Cape route. And obviously, the Ottoman objective was the protection of their transit income.
Right, securing those vital maritime choke points to force the trade back into the Red Sea.
The sources actually mention Alfred Bayer Mahan's sea power theory in relation to this conflict, but how does a 19th century naval doctrine apply to a 16th century Ottoman strategy?
Well, Mahan's theory, even though it was formulated centuries later, it emphasizes that true sea power relies on the dominance of harbors, coastal fortifications, and the absolute control of commercial trade routes.
It's not just about having a big fleet that sails around aimlessly looking for battles.
Exactly. And the Ottomans intuitively applied this concept. They recognized that taking on the Portuguese galleons on the open ocean was a losing proposition, so they focused entirely on securing the choke points.
Do we have evidence of them formally discussing this?
We do. We see this documented in April 1554, when the Ottoman administration summoned Özdemir Pasha, the governor of Yemen, to Istanbul.
Okay, so a high-level strategic meeting.
Yeah, the meeting was specifically to discuss strategies for fortifying the coastlines and preventing Portuguese access to the Red Sea. They understood that securing the Red Sea traffic was an existential economic necessity.
Basically a literal blockade of the Portuguese infiltration into their inner waters. But the Ottomans had a structural limitation, didn't they? I mean, they were a massive, wealthy empire stretching across 3 continents, but their attention was fiercely divided.
Highly divided. Despite their vast resources, the Ottomans were fundamentally a land-based empire, and they were facing persistent, heavy conflicts on multiple fronts.
Right, because while they were trying to manage this maritime crisis in the south, they had issues in the east.
Yeah, they were simultaneously fighting massive land wars on their eastern borders with the Safavid Empire in Persia. The Safavids were a formidable military threat.
So that pulls resources away from the navy.
Absolutely. The ongoing border clashes and full-scale wars with the Safavids required immense military and financial resources. The Ottoman High Command was constantly forced to prioritize these immediate land threats over the distant maritime trade routes in the Indian Ocean.
It's like they are fighting a two-front war, and the capital in Istanbul was just geographically and psychologically much closer to the threats in Europe and Persia than to the struggles in the Indian Ocean.
That is a perfect way to put it.
But even with those distractions, the Ottoman leadership was explicitly aware of the geography and the threat, right? I mean, in 1517, the famous Ottoman navigator and cartographer Piri Reis presented a world map to Sultan Selim I in Cairo.
He did. And the sources highlight that this map was not just some scientific curiosity. It explicitly focused on the geography of the Indian Ocean.
So it was essentially a warning.
Exactly. It illustrated the immediate threat of Portuguese raids on places like Jeddah in that very same year. The presentation of that map was essentially a strategic briefing.
So by laying out the geography of the Indian Ocean, Piri Reis showed the salt route exactly where the Portuguese were operating.
Right. He highlighted the direct threat they posed, not only to the economic lifelines of the empire, but to the sacred Islamic sites of Mecca and Medina.
Which were accessible via the Red Sea port of Jeddah.
Yeah. The map visualized the Portuguese encroachment as a dagger pointed at the heart of the Ottoman sphere of influence.
Wait, you know, looking at this map Piri Reis made, it reminds me of how we view global infrastructure today. I think about it like a vital, modern, digital fiber optic cable network.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, like whoever controls the physical infrastructure, the undersea cables, the landing stations, controls the flow of data, and therefore controls the global economy.
And in this case, the 16th century spice route was the fiber optic network of its day.
Exactly. The shipping lanes were the cables, and the fortified ports were the data centers. But this raises a major question. If the Ottomans had the wealth from their vast empire, and they had absolute awareness of the Portuguese threat to this network, why didn't they just immediately build a massive oceanic fleet that could just outmatch the Portuguese galleons on the open water?
Well, the answer really lies in the fundamental differences in naval architecture, industrial logistics, and maritime tradition. I mean, building an oceanic fleet is not a matter of simply throwing timber and gold at a shipyard.
Right, you need expertise.
You need a deep-water maritime tradition and highly specialized shipwrights. The Ottomans were undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean is a relatively calm, enclosed sea.
So their ships were built for those specific conditions.
Exactly. Their entire naval doctrine was built around the oared galley. These were long, narrow ships with shallow drafts, powered by hundreds of rowers carrying forward-facing cannons.
Okay, so galleys are fast and highly maneuverable in calm waters.
Right, perfect for coastal raiding or boarding actions.
Yeah.
But the Portuguese, however, they had spent decades navigating the brutal swells of the Atlantic Ocean and the Cape of Good Hope.
So they developed a completely different type of ship.
They developed the galleon. It is a heavy, high-sided, wind-powered ship with a deep draft for stability, and it's just bristling with heavy broadside artillery.
So basically, a Mediterranean galley trying to fight an Atlantic galleon in the open ocean is like a sports car trying to fight a heavily armored tank in a mud pit.
That is a very apt comparison. The low profile of the galley meant that in the rough swells of the Indian Ocean, water would easily wash over the decks, swamping the vessel.
Oh, man, so they couldn't even stay afloat properly.
Barely. And the Portuguese galleons literally towered over them, allowing the Portuguese to fire down onto the exposed Ottoman rowers.
That sounds like a slaughter.
Is a massive tactical disadvantage. And furthermore, the logistics of building a fleet in the Red Sea were just nightmarish. The Ottoman naval base was at Suez.
And Suez is in the Egyptian desert. There are no vast forests there.
None. Every single piece of timber, every barrel of pitch, and every cannon had to be harvested in Anatolia, shipped across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, unloaded, and then dragged across the desert by camel caravans to Suez just to be assembled.
That is unbelievable. The supply chain for their own navy was incredibly fragile.
It was. The Ottomans simply did not possess the pre-existing infrastructure or the specific technological lineage to instantly spawn a deep-water armada capable of taking on the Portuguese in open water.
Which means they had to fight the war with the tools they actually possessed. Economic theory eventually demands military action, and since they could not win a naval battle on the open ocean, they had to attack the Portuguese at their fixed points on land.
Yeah, which brings us to 1538. We see the first major confrontation at a heavily fortified Portuguese outpost, the First Siege of Dio.
So to understand the Siege of Dio, we have to look at the political landscape of India and the catalyst for the conflict, right?
Yeah, Dio was an island situated off the Kathiawar Peninsula in Gujarat, which was a very wealthy region on the western coast of India. The Portuguese had managed to secure permission to build a fortress there.
But things went south in 1537.
Very much so. The Sultan of Gujarat, Bahadur Shah, was engaged in tense negotiations with the Portuguese regarding their growing influence. During a meeting on board a Portuguese ship anchored off Dio, a scuffle broke out.
And what happened?
Bahadur Shah fell into the water and drowned.
Just like that, during a diplomatic meeting.
Yeah. And the circumstances were highly disputed, of course. The Portuguese claimed it was an accident or a preemptive strike against an assassination plot.
But I'm guessing the Gujaratis and Ottomans didn't see it that way.
Not at all. They viewed it as outright murder. This event provided the perfect justification, the casus belli, for a massive retaliatory strike against the Portuguese fortress.
So the Ottomans retaliate. How big of a force are we talking about here? Because projecting power from Suez all the way to India sounds like an administrative nightmare.
It truly was one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings of the century. Sultan Suleiman I ordered the governor of Egypt, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, to assemble a massive fleet.
How massive?
The sources indicate the Ottomans launched roughly 90 galleys from Suez.
90 galleys? And how many men?
They were carrying a massive expeditionary force of around 10,000 crew members, janissaries, and artillerymen.
Okay, so 10,000 men navigate the Red Sea, cross the Arabian Sea, and arrive at the Indian coast.
Exactly, to join forces with the Gujarati army, which was, understandably, eager to avenge their drowned sultan.
And what about the Portuguese defending the fort?
The Portuguese commander, Antonio de Silveira, was defending the fortress with an incredibly small garrison.
How small?
Just 3,000 Portuguese troops. They were facing a combined Ottoman-Gujarati source of 22,000 men.
The Portuguese were hopeless and outnumbered. You have 3,000 men huddled behind stone walls, staring down an army of 22,000. With those numbers, how did the siege actually unfold?
Well, the Ottomans made significant progress initially. They were relying heavily on their siege artillery. They managed to capture the Vila dos Rooms, a smaller secondary fort located across the Dio Channel on the mainland.
Which gave them a solid strategic foothold.
Right. And Hadim Suleiman Pasha, feeling quite confident, tried to force the captured commander of that smaller fort to write a letter to Antonio da Silveira demanding the main Portuguese garrison surrender.
Did it work?
No, Silveira flatly rejected the demand. So the siege then dragged on for weeks, characterized by brutal bombardments and bloody assaults on the fortress walls. But despite their overwhelming numbers, the Ottoman-Gujarati coalition began to fracture.
The sources actually outline a multitude of reasons for the breakdown. There were severe friendly fire incidents, right?
Yes, during a massive final assault planned for October 31st, Ottoman artillery inadvertently fired into their own advancing troops.
Oh man, that must have caused heavy casualties.
It did, and it completely ruined the momentum of the attack. But you have to remember, friendly fire in 16th century siege warfare. Given the inaccuracy of smoothbore cannons and the dense smoke of black powder, it was a constant risk.
Sure, but the more pressing issue was logistical, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Ottomans were entirely dependent on the Gujaratis for their food and supplies once they arrived in India.
And as the siege stalled and casualties mounted, the Gujarati nobility grew disillusioned.
Yeah, they started to view the massive Ottoman army not as liberators, but as a potential occupying force.
Hmm.
Consequently, they simply refused to continue supplying the Ottoman besiegers.
That just cut them off.
They decided to cut their losses and withdraw their support. So for the 10,000 Ottoman troops stranded at the end of a very long maritime supply line, this created an immediate and severe food shortage.
Starving troops and friendly fire are bad enough, but the final blow was purely psychological, wasn't it?
It was. On November 5th, the sighting of just a few Portuguese supply ships completely tricked the Ottoman command.
How does that happen?
Well, the Ottoman leadership was constantly scanning the horizon, acutely aware of their vulnerability. When those few Portuguese supply vessels appeared, the Ottomans immediately assumed they were the vanguard of the main, massive Portuguese galleon fleet sailing up from Goa.
So panic set in.
Total panic.
Yeah.
Hadim Suleiman Pasha knew his lighter Mediterranean galleys would be destroyed if they were trapped against the coast by Portuguese broadsides.
So what did he do?
He ordered a hasty abandonment of the siege the very next day, on November 6th. The retreat was so chaotic they left 1,200 dead behind, along with much of their heavy artillery, and embarked back for Yemen.
And what about the Gujaratis?
The Gujarati commander, Qajar Safar, seeing his allies flee, set fire to his own encampment and retreated shortly after.
Let me push back on the Ottoman retreat here, though. Were they just too easily spooked? I mean, we look at their land campaigns in Europe, like the Siege of Vienna or their campaigns in the Middle East, and the Ottoman command showed incredible resolve in protracted, grinding siege warfare.
They certainly did on land.
Right. So did they just lack the nerve for oceanic siege warfare, or were they genuinely terrified of the Portuguese naval reputation?
You know, it is a fair question, but looking at the mechanics of this situation, the retreat was actually based on a rational assessment of their vulnerability, not a lack of nerve.
How so?
Well, on land, the Ottomans had secure, interior lines of communication and supply stretching continuously back to Istanbul. At Due, they were marooned at the extreme end of a fragile maritime tether.
They were starving, and their local allies had betrayed them.
Exactly. And they were operating ships that they knew were structurally inferior in open water combat. They didn't retreat out of irrational fear. They retreated because their tactical position was entirely untenable.
So if the main Portuguese fleet had actually arrived and trapped them against the shore?
The entire expeditionary force of 10,000 men and the 90 ships that cost a fortune to build would have been completely annihilated. It was a strategic withdrawal to preserve the fleet.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And on the way back, they actually salvaged the expedition to some degree, didn't they?
They did. On the return journey up the Red Sea, Hadim Suleiman Pasha conquered most of Yemen, including the critical port city of Aden.
So while they failed to dislodge the Portuguese from India, they successfully consolidated their absolute control over the Red Sea choke point.
Right. It was a massive strategic consolation prize that kept the spice transit revenues flowing to Cairo.
But the Ottoman retreat to the Red Sea merely shifted the theater of war westward. The Portuguese realized they could not just sit on the defensive in India.
No. They knew they had to strike at the root of the Ottoman naval capacity.
Which dragged the Horn of Africa directly into the conflict, leading to this brutal proxy war between 1541 and 1543. So the Portuguese decided to go on the offensive.
In 1541, a Portuguese fleet commanded by Estevan da Gama launched an expedition directly up the Red Sea.
And their specific intention was to destroy the Ottoman fleet at its source, right? In the shipyards of Suez.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But navigating the Red Sea was incredibly treacherous for the Portuguese.
Because of the reefs.
The reefs, yes, it's a narrow sea filled with uncharted coral reefs.
Yeah.
But also, it is dominated by complex seasonal wind patterns that could trap sailing ships for months.
Despite these navigational hazards, Estevan da Gama actually managed to push northward.
He did.
Mm.
He sacked the Ottoman-held ports of Suakin and El Tor along the coast. However, the ultimate objective, the attack on Suez itself, failed.
Why did it fail?
The Ottomans had received advance warning of the Portuguese incursion. They pulled their ships high up onto the beaches and heavily fortified the surrounding area with artillery.
And the Portuguese just didn't have the ground forces to mount a successful amphibious assault against fortified positions, so they were forced to turn back.
Right. So, thwarted at Suez, the Portuguese pivoted to an intervention in the Horn of Africa. The political situation there was really dire.
Yeah, the Christian Ethiopian Empire, ruled by Emperor Gelawdewos, was fighting for its very survival against the Islamic Adal Sultanate.
And the Adal forces were led by an incredibly capable commander named Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, also known in the Ethiopian chronicles as Ahmed Gran.
The Portuguese saw an opportunity here, didn't they? To secure the western flank of the Red Sea by propping up their Christian allies.
That was the goal. So in 1541, Cristóvão da Gama, who was the brother of Esteban da Gama, arrived in the port of Massawa with a highly specialized expeditionary force.
The force Cristóvão da Gama brought was small, but it was technologically advanced. He landed with just 400 Portuguese musketeers, supported by light field artillery and a small detachment of cavalry.
And this intervention completely transformed a regional conflict into a major proxy war between two global empires. The Iberians and the Ottomans were now inserting specialized troops into the Horn of Africa just to bleed each other and control the Red Sea coastline.
The sources highlight that these Portuguese troops were musketeers, specifically wielding matchlock weapons like the arquebus. Why does this specific type of firearm matter so much in the context of 16th century East African warfare?
The arquebus fundamentally changed infantry combat. Prior to this, battles in the region were largely decided by cavalry, spearmen, and archers. The arquebus was an early, heavy matchlock gun.
It was pretty cumbersome, right?
Very. It often required a forked resting stand just to aim properly, and the firing mechanism relied on a smoldering piece of cord, the match being plunged into a pan of gunpowder to ignite the charge.
So a very slow rate of fire.
Slow, yes, but it fired a heavy lead ball that could pierce armor at close range and inflicted devastating traumatic injuries. The noise, the smoke, and the sheer kinetic impact of concentrated arquebus fire could shatter cavalry charges.
It must have completely broken the morale of troops who were unfamiliar with volley fire.
Absolutely. And with these 400 arquebusiers, the Portuguese initially turned the tide of the war. They marched into the Ethiopian highlands and won significant victories at the Battle of Besent and the Battle of Jarte.
But the Adal Sultanate was not without its own imperial sponsor. In response to the Portuguese successes, Imam Ahmad requested immediate aid from the Ottoman governor of Yemen.
The Ottomans recognized that if Ethiopia fell entirely under Portuguese influence, the western shore of the Red Sea would become a staging ground for constant attacks on their shipping.
So they responded swiftly.
They sent a massive reinforcement of 2,000 Arabian musketeers and 900 Turkish pikemen.
The influx of those Ottoman reinforcements was devastating to the Portuguese-Ethiopian coalition, wasn't it?
It was. In August 1542, the two forces met at the Battle of Wolfla. The combined Adal and Ottoman mercenary force completely crushed the Portuguese.
And Cristóvão da Gama was wounded and captured?
Yes. The sources note that when he vehemently refused to convert to Islam, he was personally beheaded by Imam Ahmad.
Wow. Brutal. And what did the Ottoman mercenaries do after that?
Well, having achieved their objective and claimed a massive bounty of 2,000 ounces of gold, they largely left the theater and returned to Yemen.
But Imam Ahmad made a fatal strategic miscalculation at this point, didn't he?
He really did. Believing the Portuguese threat was entirely neutralized with the death of their commander, he dismissed the vast majority of his expensive Ottoman mercenaries, retaining a personal guard of only about 200 Turkish arquebusiers.
He did not realize that while the Portuguese force was broken, it was not entirely destroyed. 50 of the original Portuguese soldiers had actually managed to survive the slaughter at Wolfla.
Those 50 survivors regrouped. They joined forces with the remnants of Emperor Gelidus' army and prepared for a final, desperate confrontation.
And that leads us to the climax of this proxy war at the Battle of Wainadaga on February 21st, 1543.
The two armies met near the shores of Lake Tana.
And the 50 surviving Portuguese, carrying a banner of holy compassion, fought at the vanguard alongside the Ethiopian forces. The battle was chaotic, but the defining moment was the death of the Imam himself.
Right. Historical sources often present differing accounts of exactly who struck the final blow here.
What does the Portuguese tradition say?
They strongly assert that a Portuguese arquebusier, often identified as a soldier named Juan de Castillo, recognized the Imam on the battlefield, charged directly through the Adal lines, and shot him at point-blank range.
The bullet hit the Imam in the chest, throwing him violently from his horse.
That's their account, yes. But the Ethiopian chronicles, conversely, claim a local Ethiopian soldier delivered the fatal strike.
Regardless of whose finger was on the trigger, the sudden, violent death of Imam Ahmad caused an immediate collapse in command and control.
It did. The Adal Ottoman forces broke their lines and fled, resulting in a devastating and total rout.
You know, the vignette of the imam's death provided in the sources is visceral. He is hit in the chest, falls from his mount, and in the ensuing panic, his wife, Batido Amara, desperately tries to escape with the surviving Turkish guards and whatever treasury they can carry, while the victorious Ethiopian army pours into their camp.
It's a dramatic scene.
It brings up a really interesting question about the nature of the fighting force. How does a deeply personal vendetta like those 50 surviving Portuguese soldiers seeking revenge for their executed commander alter the combat effectiveness of a military unit compared to standard imperial orders?
It completely overrides the standard military doctrine regarding unit preservation. I mean, when an army operates under standard imperial orders, the objective is to secure the tactical goal while minimizing casualties.
Ensuring the unit remains effective for the next campaign.
Exactly. But those 50 Portuguese survivors were operating outside of that framework. They were isolated, heavily outnumbered, and their commander, who had inspired fierce loyalty, had been executed.
So their primary objective was no longer securing a trade route or propping up an ally.
It was vengeance. They wanted to kill the imam. That kind of hyper-focused, fatalistic motivation makes a small unit incredibly dangerous.
Because they are willing to take audacious, suicidal risks.
Like charging directly into a defensive line just to get a point-blank shot at the enemy leader. Standard military calculus would dictate that is impossible.
Right. So while the Red Sea flank eventually stabilized into a bloody, exhausted stalemate after the Battle of Wainadaga, the Portuguese grip on their main prize in India faced an even more massive challenge just 3 years later.
Yes, we are moving to the Second Siege of Diu in 1546.
And this event is heavily defined by the rise of a very different kind of military commander, a man named João de Castro.
The 1546 siege was initiated by the new Gujarati governor of the region, Khoja Zufar, who was heavily supported by Ottoman artillery and forces commanded by Suleiman Pasha and Rumi Khan.
And the numerical disadvantage for the Portuguese defenders was even more staggering than in the first siege, wasn't it?
It really was. The fortress of Diu was initially defended by a garrison of only 400 men.
400. Against how many?
They were facing an attacking force estimated between 10 to 15,000 soldiers, supported by a massive 70-ship fleet blockading the coast.
Wow, okay. So the defense and eventual relief of Diu fell to João de Castro. He was not your typical 16th century military brute, though.
Not at all. He was a humanist, educated at the court of King Manuel I in Lisbon. He was a student of the renowned mathematician and royal cosmographer Pedro Nunes.
So he was, fundamentally, a hydrographer and a scientist who applied empirical observation to the chaos of warfare.
Castro understood that defending Diu against such overwhelming numbers required tactical innovations tailored to a resource-strapped empire. He could not afford a war of attrition. He had to fight smarter.
The mechanics of his defense were ruthless and highly technical. He utilized scorched earth tactics around the perimeter, ordering the defenders to systematically destroy any outer structures or buildings to deny the attackers cover from the fortress artillery.
And when the Ottomans attempted to breach the walls using siege mines, digging tunnels under the foundations to pack them with gunpowder, Castro employed countermines.
How exactly does a 16th century countermine work?
It requires acoustic engineering. The defenders inside the fort would place drums or bowls of water on the ground near the walls to detect the subtle vibrations of the enemy digging beneath them.
That's incredibly clever.
Once they pinpointed the direction of the Ottoman tunnel, Castro's men would dig their own intercepting tunnel. They would break into the enemy shaft in the dark, engage in brutal, confined, hand-to-hand combat underground, and collapse the Ottoman mine before the powder could be placed.
And above ground.
Above ground, Castro used fire ships against the anchored enemy galleys.
Fire ships are a terrifying concept.
Absolutely terrifying. They would take old, expendable vessels, pack them tightly with pitch, resin, sulfur, and gunpowder, set them ablaze, and use the wind and tide to steer them directly into the densely anchored Ottoman fleet.
The ensuing chaos would force the enemy ships to cut their anchor lines and scatter, disrupting the blockade.
Yes. And most importantly, Castro utilized his heavier galleons not merely as transport vessels, but as floating artillery platforms, feigning retreats to lure the lighter Turkish vessels into deep water before devastating them with heavy broadside engagements.
His commitment to the defense was absolute and incredibly personal. Before arriving himself, he dispatched a relief force commanded by his own son, Fernand,
And, tragically, Fernand was killed in the brutal fighting during the siege.
which is heartbreaking. To fund the continued defense and assemble the final, decisive relief armada, Castro executed one of the most striking financial maneuvers in colonial history. He needed money to pay mercenaries and provision the ships, so he secured a massive loan of 21,146 pardons from the citizens of Goa.
To understand the weight of that sum, a single pardon represented a significant amount of silver, roughly equivalent to a month's wages for a skilled laborer or common soldier.
So 21,000 pardons was an absolute fortune.
Enough to float an armada. And the way he guaranteed the loan is just legendary. He did not offer land or titles as collateral.
No, he offered a symbolic pledge of hairs plucked from his own beard, along with the bones of his recently deceased son, Fernand.
It was a masterclass in psychological leadership and political theater. The citizens and merchants of Goa were so moved by his personal sacrifice, his grief, and his unimpeachable honor that they provided the funds immediately.
And they respectfully returned the symbolic pledge as a gesture of solidarity. With that funding secured, Castro led the final relief force himself.
He arrived at Diu and achieved total victory on November 10, 1546. The Ottoman Gujarati forces suffered massive casualties, their siege lines were broken, and they were forced to abandon the campaign entirely.
Following the lifting of the siege, Castro did not just rest on his laurels, did he?
No, he launched brutal, punitive expeditions along the Indian coast, attacking the port cities of Cambay and Bijapur, burning infrastructure, and securing the maritime routes to ensure Diu would not be threatened again.
He was elevated to the rank of Viceroy of India shortly before his death from illness in 1548. But alongside his military legacy, he left a massive intellectual contribution to the empire.
He authored detailed navigational rudders, known as the roteros. These were not just simple maps. They integrated classical geography with bleeding-edge empirical observations.
He was systematically mapping the magnetic variation of the compass, recording how the needle deviated from true north at different longitudes, and charting wind patterns and ocean currents.
Those roteros fundamentally advanced Portuguese navigation. Before Castro, much of the maritime knowledge was based on ancient texts from Ptolemy, combined with the rough, trial-and-error experience of sailors.
So Castro applied the scientific method.
He collected raw data on his voyages, standardized it, and created mathematical navigational tools that gave Portuguese captains a massive technological edge in navigating the treacherous Indian Ocean.
Looking at the career of João de Castro, I see a modern tech CEO executing a ruthless, hostile takeover of a rival industry. I mean, he is using bleeding-edge data, in his case, the science of terrestrial magnetism and hydrography, combined with absolutely pragmatic resource management to defeat a numerically superior legacy competitor.
He did not just fight harder, he fought smarter, weaponizing mathematics and physics as tools of imperial expansion.
He proved that applied science could overcome sheer numerical superiority. With Diu definitively secured, the Ottoman High Command realized that the Gujarat route into the Indian Ocean was permanently closed to them.
The Portuguese galleons were just too strong, and the fortresses were too well defended.
So, forced to find another pathway to strike at the Portuguese monopoly, the Ottomans pivoted their strategic gaze eastward, toward the Persian Gulf.
Which brings us to the Persian Gulf campaigns and the resulting series of Ottoman naval disasters between 1552 and 1554.
Right. The Ottomans had successfully captured the city of Basra, located at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in 1546. This capture opened a second maritime front, giving them access to the Persian Gulf.
So in 1552, they dispatched their most famous cartographer and admiral, Piri Reis, from the naval base at Suez.
Piri Reis was given a monumental task. He was ordered to sail down the Red Sea, round the Arabian Peninsula, and eliminate the Portuguese presence from the northwestern Indian Ocean.
And his specific primary target was the massive Portuguese fortress at Hormuz, which guarded the entrance to the Persian Gulf.
He sailed down the coast with a fleet of galleys, successfully attacking and sacking the Portuguese-held city of Muscat. But when he finally reached Hormuz, the limits of his fleet became apparent.
The siege failed.
Hormuz was notorious for being nearly impregnable, wasn't it?
It was an island fortress, heavily defended by artillery, and the Ottoman galleys simply did not have the firepower to breach the massive stone walls.
And keeping a siege force applied on an arid island with limited fresh water was a logistical nightmare.
Faced with a stalling siege, depleting supplies, and reports that a massive Portuguese relief fleet was approaching from India, Piri Reis made a highly controversial command decision.
He abandoned the siege. Fearing his fleet would be trapped and destroyed, he took only 2 heavily loaded galleys and retreated up the Persian Gulf to the safety of Basra.
Leaving the rest of his fleet and his men behind to fend for themselves.
And the cost of that failure and that perceived cowardice was his life. When reports reached Istanbul, Sultan Suleiman I was furious. He ordered Piri Reis executed in Egypt.
It is a deeply tragic historical irony.
It really is. Here is Piri Reis, the brilliant cartographer who literally mapped the world for a sultan, only to be executed for failing to conquer a single fortress on that very map due to the severe inherent limitations of the fleet he was given.
And the string of disasters in the Persian Gulf continued unabated. The following year, in 1553, the Ottomans needed to bring the fleet that Piri Reis had abandoned back from Basra to the Red Sea.
They appointed an admiral named Murat Reis the Elder for the task.
As he attempted to break out of the Persian Gulf, he encountered a large Portuguese fleet commanded by Diogo de Noronha in the Strait of Hormuz.
What followed was the largest open sea engagement between the two empires.
Murat Reis, commanding oared galleys in deep water, was soundly defeated by the broadsides of the Portuguese galleons and was forced to retreat back to Basra in disgrace.
Then, in 1554, they tried yet again. Seti Ali Reis was appointed to command the fleet and bring it home.
He managed to break out of the Persian Gulf, but was intercepted and defeated by the Portuguese in the Gulf of Oman.
And as he tried to escape with his remaining battered ships, a massive Indian Ocean storm caught his fleet and blew them entirely off course, driving them all the way across the sea to the coast of Gujarat in India.
His ships were destroyed, and he was stranded, forcing him to undertake a grueling, years-long overland trek through hostile territory just to get back to Istanbul.
We really need to analyze the structural mismatch that caused these repeated disasters. I mean, the Ottomans were repeatedly trying to fight an oceanic war using Mediterranean galley tactics, and it was suicidal.
The design of a galley places the rowers low to the water. The hull has a very shallow draft, meaning it sits on top of the water rather than cutting deep into it.
This is great for the calm Mediterranean, but in the swells of the Gulf of Oman, those ships roll violently.
Furthermore, galleys carry their main artillery at the prow, pointing forward. They have to point the entire ship at the enemy to fire.
While the Portuguese galleons had deep V-shaped hulls that provided a stable firing platform even in rough seas,
They relied entirely on massive sails to capture the powerful ocean winds, and they carried dozens of heavy cannons along their broadsides.
so in the open waters, the galleys were simply outgunned, outmaneuvered, and structurally outmatched by ships specifically designed for the rigors of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans.
But there is a fascinating silver lining to Seti Ali Reis's disaster.
Oh, what's that?
His long, forced walk home resulted in a major literary and scientific byproduct. During his overland journey, he wrote the Mirat-ul-Mamalik, a detailed account of his travels through India and Central Asia.
And the Kitab al-Muhit, right?
Yes, a comprehensive guide for navigators detailing the geography, ports, and winds of the Indian Ocean. Despite the total military defeat, this represented a rare, significant Ottoman effort to codify Indian Ocean navigational knowledge.
I want to push back on the historical narrative surrounding these admirals, though. Were men like Piri Reis, Murat Reis, and Seti Ali Reis actually incompetent commanders? Or were they brilliant navigators set up to fail by an Ottoman high command that fundamentally misunderstood the physics and logistics of oceanic warfare?
It is almost entirely the latter. These men were highly competent Mediterranean sailors, brilliant cartographers, and seasoned combat veterans. The failure was institutional.
The Ottoman high command in Istanbul, sitting safely on the shores of the Bosporus, just lacked a fundamental understanding of oceanic conditions.
They looked at a map and simply drew a line from Suez to Hormuz. They kept sending fleets of light, low-draft galleys against heavy, towering galleons,
Expecting the sheer willpower and bravery of their commanders to overcome the fundamental laws of physics and naval architecture.
Exactly. The admirals were given impossible missions, armed with the wrong tools, and then executed or disgraced when they inevitably failed against the superior maritime technology of the Portuguese.
Those repeated, catastrophic grand fleet failures finally forced a complete rethink of Ottoman maritime strategy.
They realized they could not win the set-piece naval battles.
So they moved away from large-scale armadas and shifted to asymmetric warfare. This takes us to the shift to guerre de course, or corsair warfare, and the eventual tense truce that settled over the region.
Recognizing the futility of confronting galleons directly, The Ottomans shifted to state-sponsored piracy. They empowered regional commanders and privateers like Seafarese, who became highly successful at disrupting Portuguese shipping in the Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean.
The strategy was simple: avoid the heavy warships.
Instead, these corsairs would use their fast, maneuverable vessels to hunt down isolated Portuguese merchant ships, capture their cargo, and retreat to the safety of fortified coastal inlets before the galleons could respond.
It was a war of economic attrition rather than territorial conquest. And this shift in strategy reveals a deeply unexpected economic outcome.
What's that?
Well, when you look at the scoreboard of naval battles, Diu, Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, the Portuguese clearly won. But despite all those massive military defeats, historical evidence shows that Ottoman trade actually thrived in the 1540s, 50s, and 60s.
It did. Goods like black pepper, textiles, and precious stones were flooding back into Ottoman ports like Basra, Jeddah, and Alexandria, generating massive tax revenues for Istanbul.
This is where we must assess the geopolitical reality of the conflict. After decades of bloodshed, neither empire could decisively eliminate the other.
The Portuguese realized they could not project enough ground power to conquer and hold massive land-based Ottoman transit hubs like Basra or Aden.
And the Ottomans realized they could not build an oceanic fleet capable of breaking the Portuguese open ocean monopoly. Because neither side could achieve total victory, a dual hegemony emerged.
It became a status quo antebellum. An unspoken, tense truce settled over the region.
Portugal dominated the open ocean trade route, carrying massive quantities of spices around the Cape of Good Hope back to Lisbon.
Meanwhile, the Ottomans securely controlled the overland routes, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the flow of goods through the Levant into the Mediterranean.
The Ottomans also opted to indirectly undermine the Portuguese by acting as an arsenal of empires supplying heavy cannons and muskets to Portuguese enemies, like the Ace Sultanate in Southeast Asia, rather than confronting the galleons themselves.
This requires us to revisit the broader question of the entire conflict. Did the Ottomans actually fail?
Right. If we view their objective through a purely military lens, measuring success by naval battles won and fortresses captured, then yes, their Indian Ocean campaigns were a failure.
But if their primary goal was economic securing the revenue from the spice trade to fund their empire, then the resurgence of the Red Sea trade suggests a massive, unheralded success.
The Portuguese tried to establish an absolute global monopoly, and the Ottomans successfully fought them to a standstill, forcing the Portuguese into a position where they had to grudgingly share the wealth of the global spice trade.
To illustrate this shift from cannons to commerce, we can look at the specific diplomatic warnings sent by the Ottomans to the Portuguese king Dom San Sebastian in 1564 and 1565.
The Ottomans sent official letters warning the king to order his captains to stop disrupting merchant ships and Muslim pilgrim routes in the Indian Ocean.
But it wasn't just a threat, it was a negotiation. In exchange for peaceful transit, the Ottomans offered the Portuguese official trade access and favorable customs rates in the port of Basra.
It was a clear signal that the era of massive fleet actions was over, replaced by pragmatic economic diplomacy. Consider the modern parallels of this dynamic. What happens today when two global superpowers realize they cannot militarily destroy one another without wrecking the global economy?
They must grudgingly share the world order to keep their economies afloat.
They engage in proxy wars, asymmetric disruption, supply weapons to each other's enemies, and eventually settle into a tense economic detente, exactly as we saw between the Ottomans and the Portuguese in the 16th century.
It is a pattern of great power competition that repeats endlessly throughout history. The realization that mutual economic destruction is far worse than sharing a monopoly forces a pragmatic, if uneasy, peace.
The Portuguese got their Cape route, the Ottomans secured their Red Sea transit revenues, and the global economy adapted to accommodate two massive supply chains.
It's a fascinating conclusion to such a chaotic era.
As we wrap up this deep dive into 16th century economic warfare, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought derived from the sources. Fast forward a few decades to the year 1588. The combined Spanish-Portuguese naval power was severely, catastrophically crippled by the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the British in the English Channel.
At that moment, Iberian naval supremacy across the globe was deeply vulnerable.
Right. If the Ottoman government in Istanbul had been more acutely attuned to global developments and had capitalized on this sudden decline by sending a strong, modernized navy to support their regional allies in East Africa, like the corsair Mir Ali Beg, they might have entirely rewritten the colonial history of the Indian Ocean.
The Portuguese dominance, weakened from the disaster in Europe, could have been broken entirely, opening the door for an Ottoman Indian Ocean empire.
It is a massive historical what-if regarding the interconnected nature of global conflicts for you to ponder.
It really is.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.